Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Star Trek Ferengi episodes. In this video, I count down my top 10 favorite and my bottom 5 least favorite episodes from all 5 Star Trek series that feature and are centered around the Ferengi. For this countdown, I judge each episode specifically on the storyline involving the Ferengi and how well it handles the Ferengi. So, I've never considered Ferengi episodes to be amongst my favorite. In fact, whenever DS9 would show a preview for next week's episode, and it would be a Ferengi-centric episode, I'd always sigh with disappointment, and sometimes I wouldn't even bother tuning in to watch it. However, it wasn't until putting this list together that I fully realized that most Ferengi-centric episodes are not good. In fact, most of the episodes in this top 10, I would say, are just okay or mediocre. So I actually considered making this video a top 10 worst and top 5 best, as it's not until we get to my top 4 that I start to consider these episodes really good. But I decided to stick with my usual format, so this top 10 will mainly be for the Ferengi episodes that don't totally suck until I get to my top 4. But let me start with the ones that do totally suck. The worst of the worst, my bottom 5 least favorite Ferengi episodes, starting with my number 5, The Emperor's New Cloak. Such a poorly executed, half-assed episode that was a very disappointing way for DS9 to end its Mirror Universe story arc, with a ridiculous story about Zek going into the Mirror Universe to try to make a profit, and Quark and Rom having to go rescue him, which is such a dumb premise to begin with, but made even worse by how poorly it was executed, featuring Ron being a moron and constantly pointing out everything that's different, because if there's one thing the Mirror Universe needed, it's a character spelling out every single difference to the audience, because we're too dumb to catch it ourselves. It was just dumb, relying on a hot girl-on-girl action, jokes that weren't funny at all, cheap thrills, and a plot that falls flat on its face, making this my number 5 worst Ferengi episode. Coming in at number 4 is Rascals. This is the episode where Picard, Guinan, Ro, and Keiko get into a transporter accident where they are transformed into children, and then the Enterprise gets taken over by rogue Ferengi and Klingon ships. So the premise of this episode sounds somewhat interesting, but the execution was absolutely horrible, and focusing on the Ferengi aspect, the way these Ferengi take over the Enterprise happens far too easily. It is completely and totally unbelievable how easily these rogue Ferengi managed to take over the flagship of the Federation, and from there the episode just becomes a dumb, ridiculous story of how incredibly stupid and easily fooled these Ferengi that took over the flagship of the Federation are. An absolutely horrible episode. Number 3 on my worst list is The Battle. The first season Next Generation episode was somewhat interesting, as it gave us an interesting backstory about Picard's previous command of the Stargazer, but the episode itself was just over-the-top silly nonsense with a bland plot executed poorly. This is when the show was still trying to make the Ferengi the main enemy of the Next Generation, and after this episode they realized that the role would work much better as a comedic role. Here is seeing a Ferengi captain trying to get revenge on Picard for killing his son and using some weird mind control device to make him relive the events but attack his own ship. I'm sorry, but nothing about this plot works. Next, getting to my number 2, which is Acquisition, a prime example of why the first 2 seasons of Enterprise were total crap. First of all, this was Enterprise running away from its own premise, as Enterprise is set centuries before the Next Generation in order to tell different stories with different aliens, and yet they introduce a Next Generation timeline alien where it makes absolutely no sense for them to make contact with humans this early, as it spits in the face of all continuity. But beyond that, the episode itself is just horrible, as it repeats all the same tired Ferengi jokes and overused cliched plot of having 3 thugs and one of them is an idiot that's, picked on by the other thugs, so our heroes exploit him in order to defeat the bad guys. It's so unoriginal, offers nothing new, and relies on Ferengis creeping onto Paul to try to build up sex appeal. Ugh. And my number one least favorite Star Trek Ferengi episode is Prophet and Lace. And I would even go as far to say this is the worst episode in the entire Star Trek franchise. After I talked about this episode in my Deep Space Nine Top 10 video, where I naturally named this episode as the worst Deep Space Nine episode, a commenter posted a link to an interview with Alexander Siddig at a convention as he directed this episode, and he talked about why it failed, and he stated it was because he directed it like a dark drama, which isn't what the writer intended, nor what the producers wanted, so they tried to change it into a comedy episode in post-production in the editing process, and it didn't quite work. But with all due respect to Mr. Siddig, I feel this episode was failed from the beginning, as the script itself is absolutely horrible. He did talk about how the scriptwriter thought it was the funniest thing he ever wrote, but Alexander didn't really find it funny, and I can totally see why, because in fact I agree with his decision to try to shoot it as a dark drama, but honestly, nothing could possibly save this god-awful script that just uses every single Mrs. Doubtfire cliche, and the irony of this episode in promoting equal rights for women, and it just champions every, endless cliche of gender cliche about, paints women as weak and irrational creatures that just love makeup and stuff. It was basically, what all these men dressing up like women in comedies do, which is why I hate them. That and the fact that it's just not funny, so I do believe this is the very worst episode of Star Trek ever. So enough of the negativity, now let me get to my top 10 favorite Star Trek Ferengi episodes, but before I get to my top 10, let me start with an honorable mention that didn't quite make my list, and that is Little Green Men. Although I don't like this episode as much as many others seem to, as I found the story of Quark, Rom, and Nog traveling back to 1950s America to be the Roswell aliens a bit too ridiculous for my taste, and it's not as funny as it tries to be. But it was a fairly entertaining episode, and I'd be lying if I didn't say seeing Quark interact with 1950s American military wasn't a little bit funny. So it was entertaining enough. So now let's get to my top 10 favorite Ferengi Star Trek episodes, starting with my number 10, Family Business, the episode in which we're first introduced to Quark and Rom's mother, Moogie. It's not the most interesting episode in the world, but this was an interesting character, and the family dynamic between the three of them was very nicely played, as the three of them did have chemistry. And it was interesting seeing Rom go Moogie all the time, as he had more of a childish, motherly love for her, whereas Quark was a lot more stern and disappointed with her attempts to gain equal rights. So it was an entertaining episode in that regard. Next, we'll get to my number 9, which is Body Parts. And again, focusing just on the Ferengi storyline of Quark being told he was dying and thus, selling his vacuum body parts, only to find out that the whole thing was just a setup by Brunt to get him to sell his dead body, thus leading him to choose between killing himself to fulfill the contract, or essentially being exiled from all Ferengi and everyone refusing to do business with him. And this was an interesting choice in how he was very seriously considered killing himself over this, and this did present Brunt as a truly despicable individual. So yeah, this was an entertaining episode. Next, we'll get to my number 8, which is The Price, which again, I'm just looking at the Ferengi parts of this episode, as the, Troy romance part of the episode was kind of a wash. But it was more interesting seeing the Federation in the bidding war with the Ferengi for a stable wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, and seeing Data and LaForge, figuring out that the wormhole isn't in fact stable, as when they go through it they find themselves in the Delta Quadrant, and how the Ferengi refuse to listen to them. And also that Troy's lover, he turns out to be a less than moral, and he in fact teams up with the Ferengi in an attempt to sabotage the Federation. And it was really fascinating seeing Troy call him out on this, and I felt this was a good use of the Ferengi. Coming in at number 7 is The Nagus, the episode that introduces us to the leader of the Ferengi Alliance, the Grand Nagus, who is just as swarmy and sleazy as one would expect the leader of the Ferengi would be. And he was played wonderfully by Mr. Inconceivable himself, Wallace Shawn. And the story itself is interesting enough as Zek faked his death and appointed Quark to succeed him, which was apparently all just a test for Zek's son, who incidentally mysteriously disappears from Star Trek lore and the universe after this episode, but that's neither here nor there. So although I wouldn't refer to this as one of Deep Space Nine's best episode, as it does suffer a bit from the cheesy quality inherent with the first season, but as a Ferengi episode, it does hold up as somewhat interesting, and it was great seeing how Quark would act as the Ferengi leader, and the poor way in which he treats his brother coming back to bite him on the ass. So let's get into my number 6, which is Rules of Acquisition. This is the first time we meet a Ferengi female, as Ferengi women are forbidden from wearing clothes, making money, or leaving their homeworld, but this woman disguises herself as a man in a sort of homage to Shakespeare's The Twelfth Night, which again isn't one of the best episodes in the world, but it's pretty solid and works as a story that displays the discrimination that Ferengi women face and adds some serious commentary to this that is typically just, to the Ferengi, and that they're typically just used for comic relief. And the comedy in this episode does work, as though, unlike Prophet and Lace, it's also a cross-dressing episode. But the reason why this episode works where the other one fails is that it focuses more on the inequality that Ferengi female experience rather than playing off as a gender stereotypes, and it finds humor in more subtle ways. And the episode is actually more plot-driven, and the humor plays more subtle off of this plot rather than just hitting you over the head. So yeah, it's a good episode. Next, let's get to my number 5, which is Profit Motive. This silly episode shows Grand Nagus Zek returning from the Gamma Quadrant, and all of a sudden wanting to, change the Ferengi Alliance, and involves Quark and Rom in his quest to rewrite the Ferengi rules of acquisition. And although the premise of this episode is of the wormhole aliens rewiring Zek's brain to make him more evolved, which effectively turns him into a peace-loving pacifist, was a bit far-fetched, it was still really entertaining to see, and it allowed for a lot of funny moments. One of my favorite lines was when Rom was quoting Grand Nagus Zek to Quark, and he said, "Rom, it's time the Ferengi moved beyond greed." And Quark's response was, "What do you mean beyond greed? There's nothing beyond greed." So this really played off how entrenched Quark is in the Ferengi culture, and the ending was just great, where Quark goes and makes his case to the wormhole aliens on why the Ferengi need greed, and they're just like, I think we should change this one as well. And then he's like, wait, if you keep changing us, then more of us will come and we'll just keep annoying you and bothering you. And they're finally like, okay, fine, then we'll just change them back so you can go away. So that was a funny way to resolve the episode. Although I was initially irritated that the first use of the wormhole alien since the pilot episode was a silly Ferengi episode, this was made up for in later seasons. So looking back on it now, it was a fun and effective Ferengi story. So now let me get into my top 4, where the episodes really start to get good, starting with my number 4, The Dogs of War. So let me be clear that I'm only judging the Ferengi storyline of this episode. If I were also to include the Dominion War storyline of Kira, Garrick, and Damar on Cardassia trying to build a civilian revolution, then I would probably put this episode at number 1, but I'm just looking at the Ferengi stuff, and this was actually better than usual. This was the penultimate episode of Deep Space Nine, so they were looking at wrapping up all the various storylines. So they wanted to wrap up the whole Ferengi arc, and what they do is basically just a rehash of the episode The Nagus, where Grand Nagus Zek announces he's retiring and announces Quark as his successor. Now, at first I was off-put by the fact that this was just a rehash of the Negus. However, ultimately, I thought it was executed much better here. For one thing, this wasn't just a test and he really was retiring, but the twist where he actually meant to announce Rom as his successor because it's a new reform for Ferengi, and that twist does make this episode good. But one of my favorite scenes is where Quark is complaining about the new reforms on Ferengi, and Rom half-heartedly just easily comes up with powerful retorts to all of his complaints, when really all he wants to talk about is who gets the bar. And this was where there's an awesome line where Quark pays homage to the classic Picard line from Star Trek First Contact, where Quark yells, "The line has to be drawn here, this far, no further." And the way he does it was just so great. So overall, a good Ferengi episode. So next, let's get to my number 3, Bar Association. The entire introduction of the Ferengi race was meant as a criticism of capitalism, as Gene Roddenberry in the Next Generation era was devoted to portraying his vision of a moneyless paradise future. In fact, the word Ferengi was derived from an Afghan word for white man. Although by the time they got to Deep Space Nine, the Ferengi were portrayed more as a sleazy used car salesman, this episode goes back to its roots in exploring the darker side of capitalism as it champions the importance of unions and workers' rights. As one of my favorite scenes from this episode is when Bashir tries to convince Rom to fight against the inhumane treatment he receives as one of Quark's employees, and Rom says, "Well, you don't understand. Ferengi workers don't want to stop the exploitation. We want to one day become the exploiters." To which Bashir retorts, "Well, suit yourself, but I don't see you exploiting anyone," which is far more relevant in modern society than I would like it to be. And the episode itself deals nicely with this relationship that Quark and Rob had as brothers, and the unstoppable task of changing to an entire culture for the better, and how hard that is, making this a great episode. Getting to my number 2, which is Business as Usual. Yeah, I know it's a bit of a stretch to call this a Ferengi episode, but hey, I'm grasping at straws here trying to come up with some good Ferengi episodes, and this was a great episode. And it does center around Quark and his arm-dealing cousin, as well as how Quark deals with his exile from the Ferengi business world and how he intends to compensate for it, and it handles it quite nicely. This was, in my opinion, the most powerful Quark episode, as it shows him at his worst, where all hope is lost and he's struggling with the morality of becoming an arms dealer, which at first all he can do is see how much money he's making, and like any true Ferengi, that's all he cares about. But then it shows he actually does have a soul, as he eventually puts the lives of millions of innocent people above his own aspirations, showing that he does have a soul, and the journey this episode took to get there was a very suspenseful and emotionally powerful thorough ride that was executed amazingly well. So finally, let me get to my number 1 favorite Ferengi episode, which is the Magnificent Frankie. In my top 10 funniest Star Trek episode video, I named this as the funniest Star Trek episode, and I most definitely stand behind that. This episode from start to finish just filled with great effective humor and some of the best jokes ever to feature in this Star Trek episode. Is a huge achievement, especially compared to other Ferengi episodes, which tend to just come off as cheeseball episodes that are trying too hard to be funny but failing, whereas this episode is just one amazing joke after another, from Rom pleading with Nog to join their team because he knows he can fire a phaser, to Nog insisting that everyone call him Sir, to the hilarious debacle in the Holly Suite where they were practicing attacking the Jem'Hadar soldiers and Rom just slams into a wall, to the debacle at the end of the episode with, a guest appearance from Iggy freaking Pop, where they prop up a dead Vorder and use stimulators to make him walk, and then the prisoner exchange, which was just hilarious. On top of that, this episode actually managed to have an engaging plot by bringing together these 7 different Ferengi characters, including the despicable Brunt, Quark's arm-dealing cousin, to also introducing a Ferengi hitman, and the way they played off the humor of this was amazing. Sure, the premise is really shaking as it does kind of spit in the face of continuity by ignoring the fact that Zek has access to a powerful military force and acts like all Ferengi are spineless wimps who don't know how to fight, which is not how they were portrayed on The Next Generation, but who cares, because this episode is hilarious, making it my #1 favorite Star Trek Ferengi episode. So that's it for my top 10 favorite Star Trek Ferengi episodes. Be sure to keep an eye on my channel as I continue to do Star Trek videos. Also be sure to check out my channel for many other videos I do on other shows like Game of Thrones, Black Sails, The Expanse, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.